Welcome to the Friday seminar series. This week we are CAPS is offering the Friday seminar series, and our speaker, as many of you know her, is Karen Fingerman. And I'm not going to go through the long list of accomplishments. I'm going to let her do that. But I do want to say that it's a pleasure to be Karen's colleague, not only at this university, but at another university too, where we have been fellow travelers in aging over, I don't want to say how many decades. Anyway, I'm going to let Claire take it away with the this.
This morning, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Fingerman. So Dr. Karen Fingerman is the Wilson Regents Professor of Human Ecology, Director of the Texas Aging and Longevity Consortium, and the Director of Research at the UT Austin's Center on Aging and Population Sciences. She has nearly 200 publications addressing social and emotional aging, including older adults and intergenerational family ties and broader social networks, and physical and cognitive functioning across adults. Using a variety of sensors and tracking methods to examine older adults' activities, sleep, and well-being in a naturalistic setting. She received a Distinguished Mentor in Gerontology Award from the DSS section of GSA in 2020, the Baltz Distinguished Research Award in Psychology of Aging from the American Psychological Association in 2022, and I think perhaps most impressively took second place in the Great Blanton Bake Off in 2024. So please welcome me in joining Dr. Finger.
I'm honored to be here. Actually, I was saying to a couple of my colleagues, this is actually nervous, but I'm actually nervous and to this audience. And so I'll do my best and we'll see what I can tell you about the full spectrum of daily social engagement, all the different kinds of social knowledge that we have in daily life. To start with, I want to talk about the importance of this. This is a very inspiration to get into this field, that people with stronger relationships in late life live longer, you're healthier, and you're happier. And I should give a quick shout out to say that Deb Umberson is probably the one leading authority on this, but I'm going to tell you my small part of it. And the reason I'm intrigued by this is that when you look at this is a very it's an older meta-analysis. Nothing has changed. These findings reflect the field, show us that social relationships, survival, are the strongest predictive, more so than our normal sort of culprits, if you will, obesity, smoking, those things. The thing is, I mean, smoking, you can kind of do this little thing and look at the lungs. Obesity, you can begin to look at some of the physiological factors. This is really intriguing. Why does this predict it? And let me also add that from the point of view of health intervention, it's kind of a lot easier to say, hey, come to this thing, have a few cookies, chat with some people, than to say, you know, go out there and walk 15 miles uphill. This is a good point, but it's also a very perplexing one. And that's what got me started in the field. This again, I love like showing you. Yes, I actually read the literature at least 20 years ago. So this is the classic meta-analysis. It's very well thought out model. And I do want to let you know there'll be a quiz, quickly memorize it. But as you can see, it's very complicated. And so focus on primarily psychosocial mechanisms. A little bit on and the social network, but it's a very well understanding of what we're talking about. Okay, why would it matter if you have social talk? Well, what I'm talking about here is that you need close relationships. There's no doubt about that. Everything that's done in our fields says, hey, this is the place where you're going to get a lot of support, particularly in the US. Our safety net for old age is family. So most people are going to draw it from there or from their other close ties, fictive kin, whatever it is, it's going to happen. Attachment, which begins in very early life. For those of you who study children, those of you who took the required course, which you should by the time in my department, you know that this attachment begins very early in life. What's interesting is something like it carries through old age, where these close ties still become a source of security, perceived support, affection. That's important. Survive without it, no doubt. But what's intriguing by late life is this idea of social integration. This is the idea, it's very much based in sociology, whereas the first one, psychologists have kind of dominated. Sociologists have a lot to say over here. And it's about the idea of engaging in multiple social roles. And so the idea here might be that if you're at work and things go badly, yes, there could be some spillover, but it also could be that you have to go home and something in the morning and you get to go in and be your professor's self. So this is the idea that this in the social world, roles matter. There's also literature, which I'll mention to you, which is sort of access to resources. I'm going to argue we need to go here. Okay, let me give you the other two theories I want you to keep in mind. The first is socio-emotional selectivity theory. Well, Christensen's theory, probably the dominant paradigm for almost 30 years in the field, and that's because it's so easy to research. And what it shows is that when you have a foreshortened time, focus more on the size and get them. Them today does not necessarily refute. This is where things happen. You have fewer peripheral ties to the extent that when I ask you, who are you connected to, you care about? What are the relationships in old age are going to be fewer peripheral ties, people in the circle. Doesn't necessarily tell us we don't. Other thing is that those close partners in theory give you emotional rewards. This is at a very another network diversity. When they look at who is in the actual networks, and they do these much more in keeping with the social integration perspective, they'll say, who have you engaged with? Might ask, who matters to you? The constitutions, sort of factor analysis approach. But when you look at it, and this has been done in other countries, having that mix of friends, spouse, child, neighbors, group activities that could be formal. I belong to a Rotary Club. It could be for coffee. And you get all of those better functioning. And that is looking at the constellation and the network related to that social integration assessment. Like those things are operating the same.
The major issues that are affecting residents.
This brings us to a key question that
4 months before Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. City council members say it unfortunately wasn't enough of a wake-up call.
So emotional selectivity theory suggests all the actions were the close ties. What the heck are these ties doing? Why do they matter? Why should we look at them? Okay, to begin with, this field really began, I'd say, in about 1973 with this very clever paper. In your papers cleverly, you get much more into the literature. So Mark Kronevater wrote this paper, The Strength of Weak Ties, and weak ties became probably the dominant term for not close ties. And the reason I use not close is everything outside the realm of close ties could be a not close tie. Weak ties sort of have an implicit meaning, and they are in fact connections. In this case, they were connections through your connections. Call them Kevin Bacon ties, because everybody has, 6 degrees to another tie. And his argument was very much that this was social resources. So when he first started looking, it was how do you get a job? And basically, he predicted LinkedIn. Everybody was thinking it was nepotism. For some people, mostly it's friends of friends of friends with weak tie, not close tie, because ties know everyone you know. It's insular. It was getting beyond that began this field. I also wrote about this, oh God, a long time ago, maybe at the time when I worked, in another world. And I coined the term consequential strangers to sort of bring us beyond the idea of a stranger. And what I'm doing here in this work was it's the start of this idea that you may not be naming these people. One of the reasons those peripheral ties, what about the people you just encounter? They're more than strangers. They're not somebody who even necessarily is there to. if you do a book, you should take a picture of it. I don't know, I got translated too, so I took pictures too. It's kind of fun. Okay, let me just give you an overview of some of these kinds of people that we'll be talking about. Your coworkers, your neighbors, service provider, community group members, church, mosque, temple, volunteers, people in a familiar setting. That guy at the gym who's always there at the same time of you on the treadmill next door. Interestingly, I had someone who's told me, "Yeah, I'm having the weirdest thing. I heard that this guy who's always with me passed away. I don't even really know him beyond chit chat, and I'm really upset." I'm like, because it was part of your daily pattern. They are those connections via close ties, and they might be very distant relatives. And again, this is a subjective experience. Any one of us, your best friend in that same role. This is one of the reasons why we're looking at this, is that we don't feel satisfied that the role captures it. We don't feel satisfied that the emotion captures it. There's something or other that's both. But I wanted to give you an idea of where these might arise in here. I'm going to show you they do. Okay, we have been working from a theory that's functionalist theory that again goes back a really long way. I don't think it was well developed or well used. Weiss's article is actually kind of funny because it's so dated. It talks about housewives not being able to, anyways, it's very dated, very dated. Having had said that, it introduced an idea that we've been following, the idea that people functions in the social world contribute to that survival and that outcomes. And that includes attachment, feeling that you belong, and social support. Let me add that the close ties give us a combination of positive and negative emotion. And although negative emotion can be bad, they also always have to be. Here a verdict, showing that at times negative emotion in a relationship can actually stimulate different biological phenomena that can be beneficial, depending. I mean, I'm not saying extreme, whatever, but within your sort of well-functioning relationships, that's still part of it. Those peripheral ties, those weak ties, give you that social capital that is there. You can get a lot of resources, potentially information, other things from people you don't know what. That extra connection. Stimulation and novelty. That is an area where we've been very interested in the proper stimulation. I won't be able to show it today, but we do have a paper on you with some machine learning on some of the things we've looked at, arguing that the language you have to use with people who are close to you is more complex. That has a brain to it. And that's because when I'm with my husband, I can say to him, "You remember the trip to France?" And he goes, "Oh my God, yes. You know, when we were in Nice on the beach." And I'm like, "Yes." And we can laugh. I mean, that's the extent of what I need. Whereas if it's you, I've got to go through and explain the whole thing. 15 years ago, my husband and I went, and then we were on the beach, and there was this thing that happened, and I probably have to use some prepositions. And all of a sudden, it's a complicated situation. I didn't saw this. It was during COVID. If you were lucky enough to shelter in place with your close social contacts, at the end of the day, said, "I went into the kitchen and I got a really good snack today." And they said, "Yeah, remember I was there and I took a bite." And that was your, you know, like, what did you have to talk about? So all of a sudden you're Zooming that college roommate you haven't spoken to in 30 years because there's something new to talk about. And that really brought it to the core. These contexts give some degree of novelty, some degree of stimulation. You can't quite, yes, you know, marital researchers might say that's why you have to go out and do new things with your spouse. And you can, but it just happens. Outside settings. So the fact that you are at the gym is the same matters. A lot of big situations are intimidating. There's not someone there who grounds you. That can be true for introverts. You don't necessarily talk to them, but they're there. You know what to expect. It's a matter of life and not always. Another part is that it can give you a connection to the past. There are the people who you don't see, and all of a sudden you see them and you're back in that moment. You might not name them if I asked you to name them. All of a sudden they're there, and that was another part of that COVID thing. And again, think of that pattern to daily life. There's a sequence of people. We are social creatures. We like the social sequence. All of that are functions. Weiss doesn't talk about all the functions, but I wanted to say that he introduced that idea to me that you have to have the functions to optimize your social life. Okay, I'm going to start talking about my work. This was one of my oldest studies. It's an old but a goodie. And what happened here, and for all of our young people, I'm going to have to tell you like some history. In the 1990s, or that in the holiday season, we would go and get cards, and we would writer's cramp. Oh my gosh, because we would write so many. Then we would risk paper cuts on our time, make an envelope, walk uphill through the snow and find these blue boxes and put it in. And then they would arrive to our friends on the other side. They'd have a big stack of it. It was actually kind of fun. And so what we did is we asked people to fill out a survey about how much they feel like they affect sort of the opposite of loneliness at this season. We did a survey for every single card they received. What it was about to them, what it meant to them. And they provided us with a card or a photocopy. So we could do an analysis to begin to look at this. And what we found is that, well, I think found is that the social embeddedness, which is that opposite of loneliness, was predicted by the number of cards from movie times. Knowing that the people were thinking about it, that you hadn't even necessarily thought about during the year mattered. It was important. I mean, this was really profound for us. It speaks to that personal past connection. I should add, more emotion out of it. It felt more emotionally moved by these connections. And part of that was, I'm not going to talk about today, the social input theory, which is that older adults benefit from more favorable social input. People send them things that, you know, Grandma, I love you from the bottom of my heart. You mean so much to me in my life. And young people get, you know, a reindeer drinking cappuccino as a card, you know, so it's a different stimulation there, but they also had very different experiences. And the fact that those weak ties mattered. I should add, there was somebody who put in their survey and wrote that they kept getting a card for years from their husband's former college roommate. And they said, I finally had to write to them and say, Charlie died 3 years ago, and you should just know, or whatever. That's how distant this tie was. And it's also how representative it is in the mind. Some of what goes on is just the internalization. Now, let me turn to the big show, which is our work. The Daily Experiences and Wellbeing Study has been we looked at adults over the age of 65 that could not be working more than 20 hours a week for pay, so that we have a fairly consistent daily social context. We originally did a face-to-face 2-hour interview. I'll show you what went into that. Followed by an intensive data collection in which they wore an Actical, which is sort of a very fancy Fitbit. I can tell you it's impossible right now to get a device that works the way it did, which was incredibly precise measurement of physical activity. We had them on a handheld device, an Android, which I could explain to you why for computer programming. But every 3 hours, they had a survey that popped up, neurological cognitive assessment. Then sometime I can tell you about what it's like to do that with people who have never seen a smartphone, which a third of older adults today still in there. And then we also recorded sound in the environment. Our sample is fairly representative of the greater Austin area with some oversampling for African-American participants. We did have the full battery in Spanish. Have a highly educated group that is fairly close to the education level, 65. It's close to 50%, so we're slightly over, but not much on that. And about over half were married, 50% were not. Okay, the two measures we're going to focus on. One of them is the Cohen Social Integration Measure, and it asks about 13 roles in the life. So in the last 2 weeks, have you had contact with any of your children? Notice that we're not asking how many. It's, are you a parent and did you have contact? And that makes some sense if it tends to be that if kids, they have more contact with you, the kid. So that's the way it's asked, and it's very much about position. We also did the acquaintances model, which is the subjective perception of having the innermost circle are so close it's hard to life with so on. But these are all, we have that subjective emotional, and we have the roles at that upper level participant. The baseline interview included standard psychological outcomes, cognitive battery, and a bunch of different measures of health, including strength and VMA. We also got personality assessments. We took photographs of their living space where they spend the most time. We did some really interesting coding of that and showed some different things. The interviewers would of the environment as well. We used formal neighborhood codes based on their addresses. We used the pollen count every day. We considered traffic and weather and ruled them out because the traffic is always bad in Central Texas. And the weather is pretty much always hot. It's, you know, I mean, it's, so we couldn't use it. Our collaborators in Michigan were like, oh, we have to look at weather. I'm like, yeah, probably not. What we did on the ecological momentary assessment is we took the 10 partners from the convoy model, the closest partners, loaded them onto the phone so that we could say in the past 3 hours if you had contact. Then we asked for additional persons. We did ask if they said, you know, yes, who were they, how are they related, how well the mode of contact, which I'm going to talk about. In person. Spoiler alert, digital is still not that common in, and when they use it, it's with close ties. And then were they in group or were they that onto the phone? Just so you know, really spend time with, I'm not going to talk about this in this manner. I'm going to talk about close and weak ties in their predictive value, primarily second. But this is your distribution of that on the ecological momentary assessment behaviors. This has been a very active area of publication on my collaborative team. Turns out that the array of activities you engage in, we have their mood, nothing coming in their physical symptoms. We do have daily sleep. It should have included their physical activity, sedentary assessment, and sleep. Shishu has research on sleep. We use this electronically activated recorder, which I'm going to talk a little bit about conversation and television exposure from it. I'll come back to it and show you a little bit about how we used it, but just for you to keep in mind. Let me show you our first paper that we did. And one of the things that's very interesting in our design is the ability to combine these assessments. This is to say that in the social world, it's not one phenomenon. It's such a good literature putting this all together, and we measure it together. And so that's where we started. And what we wanted to know is if you have encounters with weak ties as well as close ties, do you engage in more diverse behaviors? I just told you that's a very strong predictor. We weren't sure of that. We did this, but a number of papers on the data have shown that since then. And you'd be more physically active and less sedentary. You want to separate these two things, and it might not be news that you want to hear, but sedentary is a huge predictor of mortality of average physical activity. That means that if you went to the gym in the morning and you spent the rest of the day at your computer, you got to get up, you got to get up, you got to get up. I would have you all stand up and jump, but I won't do that right now. Just go, not be sedentary after this. Okay. Did have this distribution. I won't stay here very long. Physical activity is really bizarre. It's measured in this thing called epochs, and then you have to use enhanced software to just know that we did it right. You'll have to take my word for it because the peer reviewers looked at it. And what we found was that these diverse encounters did predict They predicted all of the things that we said they would predict. More diverse behavior. They're more physically active. They're not sedentary. You're happier because you've been out doing this and it did over time that actually is occurring, as it should, except when you graph it all together. This is our average participant. When you look, yes, what I said is occurring. It's not necessarily causal. It's co-occurring. And I want to make that point that when you have multiple devices, you can begin to see that pattern. As much as we'd like to say, oh gosh, I have 1,000 data points over time, and therefore I can say one caused the other. Often they co-occur. The other thing to look at is, so we've got our sedentary activity. I'm going to come back to this. There's a temporal pattern. And that's become more and more something that we discuss on sensory and ambulatory assessment. That there are temporal patterns, and so very complex. Other thing to note for older adults that I always find that I found really interesting when you look at this, by the way, it's minute by minute. Look that way, but that is how it's assessed. You see that peak with a lot of people, and then it goes down because you can't sustain super high energy. The other thing to know is in order to get to social integration, you have to at least get out of your chair. Americans are crazy sedentary. And even if they came to your house, you've got to answer the door and like walk a little bit with them compared to being with your spouse. So that would be your minimal. It's typically that people leave. But even if you're in the home, you're more active. I told you I would talk a little bit about our air data. These are probably our most exciting data and our data that have, published in the highest journals and so on, because they're pretty unique. We do have the largest file collection. Basically, I think at almost any age, because I was just on a coordinated analysis, and I think ours were like % of the files with 15 studies. And so 80% of those had sound content. And again, I could tell you about, we could just do a whole lecture on what it's like to try to do all of the technology as someone who doesn't really know technology. But I know who to ask. And so we did get these. What this is again, an average participant with ambient sound from actually 12 hours, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. You see the rainbow is conversation, and it's more stimulating conversation. Where you see the brown, and again to that. And by the way, we have the codes for what they were watching, and we got that at a 98% reliable, whether it was news or game show or whatever. We've never analyzed it. We probably could listen to network they were listening to. I could, but anyways, I'll get that pretty reliable. We're going to talk about the TV. Looking at again, big show honors. This was entered, CNS has a data visualization contest every year. And social scientists, we never do very well in it because, think about it. We've got the astronomy department, fancy, blah, 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 of the galaxy. And we've got like microchemistry blowing up their little cell diagrams into these fancy, amazing looking patterns. But we took second place in the CNS pattern here. Second place, Bake Off, second place. I like second place. Second place. This was Meng Hua, and she took second place. And I think it's the only time that anybody ever beat out chemistry and astronomy. So we're super happy. I think I'm going to talk about a little bit of conversation. We did code the ambient noise. What happened is we did this on the Android device. It's activated for 30 seconds out of every 7 minutes. That does decontextualize the language to a large extent. The participant has a privacy button. Every 3 hours when we do the EMA, we ask anything private occur in the every 3 hours so we can delete it. End of day, we ask anything private today you haven't thought of. End of the study, would you like to listen to any of these audios so we can delete them? We do still get things that I think we would agree are objectively private, or collectively we'd agree are private, and we delete those as soon as we hear them. So I do mean people record having sex. They record things that as soon as a transcriber said, this doesn't sound, sounds personal, turn it off, we skip it. We delete. They're double transcribed, which is very important so that you're sure you catch all of we want to catch the hus, nuances, the gunnas, those are going to be analyzable for cognitive function. That does mean as well, in case you're thinking, isn't that automated with AI now? They correct. They don't give you gunna. They give you got to. They don't give you us. You can't code the delays in it yet. And in fact, we discovered, we thought, well, what if they do the first one and then we only have a human do the second? It's more time consuming to correct so much. So we're still doing human being double transcribe in the year 2020. We code the ambient sounds, TV, traffic, music, all of that is coded. 99% reliable. One time we miss is someone didn't listen closely. We put this into the linguistic inquiry and word count software used in tens of thousands of studies, Jamie Pennebaker's software, probably the most widely used still. Like I said, we are doing some more machine learning algorithms. We are working with computational linguists. We are doing some, you know, more up-to-date things, but we're not really finding anything. This is pretty good. You know? It's fun to use the fancy tools, but sometimes even and we compare it with the embedded dictionaries. I'm going to start by going over positive and negative emotional expression scores in a little bit. Just for you to see some of his cognitive dictionaries and what we use. He has, Jamie's written a lot. By the way, if you don't know, he was head of the psychology department here. And he's just retired. He's an amazing scholar. They started doing this back in like the early 2000s with handheld walking around programs. He's like, anyways, he really was an inspiration to me in being willing to take this chance because there's a lot you have to learn. For example, the ear will not run on the iOS platform at the same time as the EMA. Your handheld computer is not actually functioning the way a computer does. It's switching when you switch apps. It doesn't do two simultaneous. You can get a program the iOS with the ear, and I would the Android with the, unless it's 2025 or Android 14 just came out. I'll tell you again another story. We don't have the ear yet. Our new device yet. Number of words are showing up. People do talk more, much closer. The weak ties are evoking more language, exactly as I predicted. And you only get a little bit of a boost when they're both together. It's really the weak ties are carrying. By the way, one of my doctoral students is now starting to work with the self-talk, talking to yourself. Look at that, they talk. I mean, it's only 52 words, but when you remember that I have 150,000 sound files, there's a lot for us to look at there. Living arrangements. Let's unpack this a little bit because living arrangements became really interesting to me during COVID. Goes on if you live alone. We have looked at marital status as well. One who was again a grad student on the program looked a lot at the marital status and language. And one of the things to keep in mind is living arrangement is not a perfect correlation in late life because people unfortunately end up in term care. Your spouse could be. So they're not the same. And I was interested in living arrangement partly because of COVID. I didn't look at language during COVID. Let me go and look at TV because I told you that is the majority of what we captured. On average, they spent 6.4 hours, 37% waking time. This is lower than the average in national studies, slightly 7.4 in the study. This is the screen of choice. If I did this with young adults and told you they're looking at their screens 37% of the time, you'd say, wow, that's really little amount of time. It's a screen of choice. And so this screen is still there. They're more sedentary, particularly if they're watching with others. So this is from the self-report. They watch TV less. If they're weak ties, they watch TV more. If they're with their close ties, perhaps not surprising given that I told you they're in the home. You know, I do go to sports bars to watch the UT games, but that's really not going to be. I'm with you. Let me say a lot of this is published. It's been through peer review. I can give you the citation. I want to show you the gestalt of how this all fits together and what you can learn. But I can certainly give you access to all the details. And I'll show you at the end, You can have my data. When people were living alone, they did not watch more TV than people with others. It's comparable, very comparable, no difference. But they were lonely. TV. They were not the same. Television is on. If you look at the ActiCal data, the people who live with others, they are sedentary. They are sitting there watching. When you look at the data from the people who live alone and the TV is coded as on, they are not sedentary. It's like CNN at the airport. They are doing things. The TV is on because it's a voice delivery. It's serving a different function. And so this is something that it's told us. The other thing that's interesting is that the self-report, people who live with others, they self-report. The people living alone have it on, but it's not serving the same function. This is important when we begin to look at the social world as to what the mechanisms are, how people are coping, and beginning to unpack it and beginning to use multiple pieces. Okay, our air data. That was not what I meant to do. I'm going to go to our follow-up study and come back to air data. We did this during COVID-19. Like many of you, as soon as the shutdowns occur, we said, oh my God, we have 6 weeks. Contact the vice president for research before it ends. And we'll get in and we'll do a study, but we won't do it the way we would have if we had 2 years, because 2 years. So much for the predictive ability of researchers sometime. We managed to get in touch with 226 of our participants that were 4-hour cycle. We use something called the end of day method. I'm going to do that retrospective. That quickly we couldn't replace this. This is during the shutdown. I'm going to just show you some regressions from the afternoon period. This is the time of most social activity. So when we looked at that, what we found is this, that when people live with others, they have in-person contact. Doesn't really shift their positive emotions. When you live alone, you are less positive in general, but you do get a boost for your people live with others, being with other people matters. Phone is the opposite effect. Having phone contact when you live alone is associated with emotion, particularly. This is an inconvenient truth because we would all like to have interventions that are technologically mediated. Oh, if I could just call them. Oh, if I could just write, that's the solution. Let's train them to do the video conference. We cannot say that it creates loneliness to talk on the phone because we can't get that fine-tuned in assessment. We can say it doesn't make it. It's the assessments are in the opposite direction. Just so you know, this might have interested you that when you live alone, you have contact in person. It's with friends and service providers. And for everybody, that phoning is with friends, pretty much. Just again, something different from home. See if I can be there. So again, you cannot say phone contact. This is loneliness. You can say it doesn't mitigate it. Loneliness is still high. Since of phone contact, you're not getting the effect you want from this. Okay, I'm now going to present some data from Xiang Zhang's presentation. And I just love the contribution to the study. And so I think one of the most interesting ways we're beginning to unpack our data. Does in-person contact matter when it's not COVID? Okay, you were totally isolated. Yes, seeing anyone, thank you. But does it matter? And does it matter whether contact is with close or weak ties in different modes? So yes, is it that in-person going to matter who is with? Okay, I'm just giving you her data, the multi-level models. If you it's here, and I'm going to let her field some of them. This is actually already published, and she only finished in the summer, so we should all do the rest. Not that quick, but anyways, what she finds is that mode of contact is not associated with loneliness in there's no lagged effect. So it's not that being lonely predicts the kind of contact you're going to have. People aren't saying, now I'm lonely, I better call someone based on what we have. Again, these are really, take my word for it, these are really good data in our field. Yes, it would be way better if we could look at co-occurrence. It's just the burden is too much. So I'm admitting limitation right there. What we do find is in a 3-hour period, in-person contact is associated with lower loneliness. That is not the case with phone and digital. And inconvenient truth. Here, when we look at weak and close ties, in-person contact with both close and weak ties is associated with loneliness. But phone and digital, it doesn't matter who it's with, is not associated with this. It's just. Okay, loneliness does not appear to motivate social contact. I should have said that the time of day was a covariate, and it does predict the social contact. We are getting that dynamic. It's been really newly being discussed in this literature. I need to figure out what's going on. And it looks like that has a stronger content than but in-person contact does mitigate loneliness. And it may have a unique effect in that, but not substituted. The modality of contact seems to be more important than the types of social ties. And this brings us into a very interesting area. Now I'm going to talk to you about that emotional expression. We used those dictionaries for positive and negative verbal expression. We can code the sound waves. We have not yet. It's complicated for a variety of reasons. We hope to do it at some point. There are some sound wave forms of positive and negative emotion, but at this point, we're using a lot of data, not the most fine-tuned analysis of verbal expression. Line is when you measure something not as precisely as you could and you find an effect that suggests that it's got a pretty loud signal. And it does. What we were interested in is we only compared at this point phone to in-person because the digital is not being widely used. We did not collect the actual digital text data, primarily because there's not as much of it. And it seems to reinforce some of the other things. And we weren't really sure how we were going to cover function from text. So this is in-person versus phone, which is by far the dominant modes of contact. And what you find is that you can be positive in either mode, but negative emotions are expressed in the context of in-person contact. So, you know, we can all sort of fake it, our charm on the phone if we wish, but to really discuss negative things is in person. There's a comfort to that. Communication. Okay, I do want to say we have a lot on this study. The one area we haven't, which is our green, is the cultural and national factors that may be influencing this. Familialism, collectivism, policies. In the US, we are very much of a family safety net in late life. In Sweden and Norway, they have much more public policy safety net. I should say from what I read in the literature, most of the literature suggests that social integration is beneficial. I'm not finding that there's some country where it's better not to have it this time. We do have structural factors, race, ethnicity, and education. Our ethnicity, we do have 45 Hispanic over the Spanish data. We do have the cognitive batteries in Spanish. We have people who are working on that, but we would very much welcome our attention to our Spanish speaking data. We have 45 African American participants with collected data on that. We've looked at individual personality beyond the big five. We have a paper on belongingness. Mung Hua, who was one of my doctoral students, has really established a phenomenal body of research on empathy and how that plays out in daily social life. And then narcissism, which is really interesting to see and how just narcissists really like to be with weak ties because they can And their close ties are just like, yeah, right. Anyways, marital status, living situation, mode of contact. Those are sort of the areas we focused our most attention on. We welcome a lot more attention. Basic idea of those weak ties get you out of ties might help you feel better at home. You need to have a diverse network. It's not. I do want to thank my collaborators. I've mentioned a lot of them. I want to thank Teaching and apps for funding for the daily experience study. Research Center for supporting all of us. And these are just sort of apps and talc a lot of support. I work on my ability to protect you as well as the institutions. If you would like to access the data, they are publicly available. The actual transcripts and the actual sound wave files are not available, but the codes are. So if you want the loop codes, you can even get those. We did a good job of organizing the data so they're user-friendly, as opposed to HRS. This has your name on it. So please access our data if you'd like. And there we go. Okay.
You're in for an extraordinary topic. Do the same as normal. We may not ask questions first, the graduate student. Questions from the graduate students.
Just out of curiosity, like what time of year?
Okay, so this took place 2016 to 2017. Goodness, we did not have one. So that we had a fairly consistent pattern through it. We started in January, started in November 2016, and we went till about April, May of 2017, do it on a fairly condensed schedule. But, you know, we didn't have a great freeze. We, you know, back in those days, just 7 years ago, I would say the weather was very consistent. It was not. So, thanks for the question. It's a good one.
Thank you so much. It's a very fascinating topic. My question was, I was really inspired when you talk about like social engagement in terms of taking different social roles. I think there's a very interesting element where, for example, maybe I don't interact with anyone, but I'm just sitting here outside and going to different places in the same day and maybe even just observing other people interact and have a relatively regulated like life pattern. And I do have a friend who happened to have a paper that seemed to show that you wouldn't be doing too bad if you don't have social interaction per se, but you have these more patterned kind of social roles you're taking versus you're doing bad if you don't have that and you also don't have social interaction. I do wonder how much do we know about, for example, the benefits of social interactions per se, versus if I just feel I'm like an accepted and functioning member of society that I'm still participating. And yes, and how do we like go from there and research that a little bit more? Because, for example, I don't have many friends at all, but I just actually, for example, really enjoy sitting in a bubble tea shop and just like reading. And that just gives me a lot of energy versus if I just sit at home and try to read, I can't really do that. So how much do we know about that in like research?
Actually, that is what we're trying to get at, is that, you know, that self-report of what roles have I been in is important because it's predictive. It's predicting, do people live long? I'm not trying to say that that measure is not meaningful, but that's exactly where our research came from, is that what goes on that people don't say, gee, I was engaged in this role. And maybe sometimes it's not on their mind, and maybe it's sometimes like you, where it occurs, but you don't feel the need to speak to that other person or to, you know, but you need to be out in the world having that social stimulation. And we would argue that that does matter. Now, your point, which is one step further, I think, is what if I like really don't engage? I don't speak. I don't, I'm just present in it. That's harder for us to capture. We're reliant on your self-report because we're just going to pick the ambient noise up. But if you think this through and I don't code you speaking, and I code the ambient noise of other people speaking, and you say I was outside the house, and you give me some of your activities that you were doing. I was reading, I was outside the house. I captured the ambient noise that was other people talking. And I can show that you felt more connected in that moment. And I've answered your question, right? I mean, we have those data. We haven't looked specifically at that. Good. If you want to, I mean, we could. Okay. So yes, that is where we started and what we wanted to get at and why we measure it so many ways. And that's a great question. And potentially another paper. So consider it. Yeah.
It is so interesting. So much data, I feel too, like so much data. But I was interested in the slide you put up where there were bars and the bottom bar was living alone and the 55 words on average picked up within a certain time frame.
That was actually being alone.
Okay.
When people are alone throughout the day, they're still talking. So they're completely alone and we're picking up words. And and it's just a really interesting question. I mean, I have some hypotheses. I think people are probably directing themselves. I think they're reassuring themselves. Say that Cibois is just starting to work on that. So, I mean,
it wasn't surprising to me. I self-talk all the time.
I know,
And then I'm like, well, there are people who don't do that. So I just think it's really interesting. I wonder, are the people who are self-talking more social, or like, is there something else different about them in terms of personality or some other characteristics? But I thought that was totally normal.
yeah, and you know what? I
Everybody did
think
it.
so there's a lot of questions there descriptively. What's going on? Who are they? I want to point out too, it's going to be a very conservative measure in comparison because people will self-talk when they're with other people in the same time frame, right? So they say in the past 3 hours, I was with all these people, but 1 hour I was alone talking to myself. And we're going to have to do that as part of the comparison, which means that if we find the signal, it's a strong signal. We have measurement error too. Yeah, Gabby. Oh, wait. Let me let Natalie ask.
Just along those lines, I was curious if you had data on pets, like maybe.
Yes. Oh my God. I've been trying to get to this paper, my pet paper. Yes. We have been trying forever because you can't clear your slate until you do your aims and your this and your that and get your ear working on your news study. But yes, we've been working on the pet paper and I just can't wait to. I'll give you a little background on that is what happened. We meet with our transcribers every single week when we're in there because we have a lot of people. Again, I should tell you to do this kind of work, you need to do a lot of math ahead of time. You need to calculate how much time everything's going to take you, how much storage space you need, buying that, how much time it's going to take to transfer data, all of that. So we met with our transcribers because we had about 15, 20 of them all over the country. We'd meet every week. What did you hear? What are your reactions? So we could begin to understand our data at a different level. And one of them told the story that a guy who lived alone was talking on day one and saying, Charlie, we got to watch the Mets tonight because we watched the Cubs last night and it's my turn to pick and so on. And it goes on for a while that he keeps talking to Charlie. And on day 2, he says, good boy, Charlie, good boy. And Charlie goes. And so speaking of living alone and conversation, people have there's a pet language pattern that's very similar to infant language. It's not completely the same. You may think it is, but there's some sound wave differences, slight. And so you think that's what people do. But when they're alone with their pet, they're having complete conversations that our transcribers couldn't identify. The dog barked. So yes. I'm so excited about it. Now ready. Okay. Yeah. Gabby was next, and then I'll go back. Yeah.
I was curious, so phone contact doesn't predict loneliness, but going back to the holiday card story, right? That the cards predicted something about a feeling of connection or someone cares about me or if people are out there. So what do you think the phone contact with others would predict? Maybe not loneliness, but is there something about, I just remember when we did our study in COVID and some of the older adults that we would call to do our research assessments, they'd be, thank you for calling. Someone cares about me. I'm so glad, like just the researcher calling them to get their interview it was really meaningful to them from what they told us. So, I mean, maybe it didn't predict their loneliness, but what would you think that phone contact would predict?
You know, Gabby, you're making me realize that one of the things we did in the holiday card study is we asked them, what did this contact mean to you? And we got things like, this is my connection to my personal past. This is whatever. And we have not done that. And again, I think it's respondent burden for us, but it would be fantastic to know what did it mean to you? Because that's really the key, right? Is what did this contact mean? And, but we also have other hypotheses that, you know, that verbal expression, there are things in facial expression. There is sort of an ability to not have purpose to moments in person. You can just be in person, and it's kind of hard to call someone and just say, I just want to be on the phone right now, you know. You can eat with people in person. It's a little weirder on the phone, and it's kind of like, you're like, oh, I just hear you chewing. So I think we're trying to unpack that. People talk about touch, but you know, there are a lot of people who have meaning to me in person, and it would Title 19 me if I touch them. So, you know, I don't think that's the key mechanism. I think that it's probably part of it. There was some research showing on Zoom that there was delays. There's a slight delay, and that's enough for people to unconsciously. But I think you've hit a key thing. In that study, we asked, you know, what is the meaning? And we don't. So it's probably key. I did have one more. If we have one more, I think you were next.
This is so fascinating. I'm wondering what is the role of disability plays into this? Does that change the outcome of the social integration? Because research has showed that some disabled people, they have another layer of like feeling of burden when they hang out with other people. So I wonder, does that change the outcome, or how does that interact?
Okay, so there's a little bit with that. Keep in mind that none of these, I should have added this, that everybody had to be independently dwelling in the community, which means they are not severely disabled. Having said that, we have enough variability to analyze data for it in functional disability. Some of the interesting thing, just a quick finding from the room study, people who have very cluttered, I should say these are independent coders who know nothing about the people. They coded the rooms. What we find is people in cluttered rooms who have a disability, higher functional disability, do better. And our hypothesis there in interpreting is that they have more control over their environment. People aren't coming in and straightening up. And also, if they're sitting down, they can grab everything they need. It's all right there. So we do have data on disability. I know, I don't know, we have some stuff that you were beginning to look at with disability and impairment. So we do have stuff in progress, and exactly what you said. If people with disability give support to someone else that day, and the answer is we don't have it with disability, we have it with life problems. Giving advice is good. It makes you still feel like you have meaning and it's something you can do. So I think I don't want to make everybody stay after school. Okay, one more. Got it. I think she was forced.
I really enjoyed your talk. I actually had a question about the phone data too. And another way, I know that for some of the phone data, you were even finding a negative effect of daily, or no effect. You also examine the between effect. So I can imagine, this is what I'm suggesting, is that like talking to somebody at the end of the time, it might remind you that you are away from them and that you miss them.
Yes, that's exactly.
But then being a person who is in regular contact with people who are away from you, so that between level of people who are getting more phone calls might be beneficial.
Let me say a couple, like you're making me think of so many things. First of all, I should say the literature, there's a emerging literature on this. We are not alone finding this. There are other studies using other techniques. We are the only ones that I think have this technique. Very consistent now. There's even an American psychologist piece on it. So we're not alone in finding it. But in terms of some of the things you're asking, I do have a paper looking at how long you've known people and whether they're someone you have a lot of contact with or not, and what it does to you in daily life. And having someone that you have a long relationship with, don't have contact with, is not good in daily life. So that is part of it.